And we are back with our first conversation for this morning. We're going to talk about St. George's Caye Day. For some people, it's a controversial topic. For others, it's a history lesson. But nonetheless, I think we'll all be able to take away something from this conversation this morning. And so in with us to help us get some enlightenment on this topic, we have Ms. Sharon Pitts, who is the committee member of St. George's Caye Day of the St. George's Caye Day Society and the past chairperson as well. We have via Zoom Rolando Cocom, who is a senior research and education officer and acting director for ISCR at NICH. And finally, last but not least, we have Mr. Gian Vasquez, who's a history lecturer, adjunct lecturer at SJCJC. Good morning to you, wonderful folks, and thank you all for being here this morning to have this discussion with us. The first thing I want to get out of the way is to ask Ms. Pitts, just to give us a brief idea of what the St. George's Caye Day Society is.
Well, the St. George's Caye Day Society is a group of volunteers and salt of the earth Belizeans, whosoever will may come, but it's a core group organization, and the name speaks for itself. The St. George's Caye Day Society has its mandate. It was formalized into a non-profit organization as well, to continue on behalf of the people and country of Belize the commemoration, along with others of course, and volunteer to be part of the National September Celebrations Committee, so that its main thrust and focus is the tent parade, around the tent parade, and retrieving and continuing to share the history of the Battle of St. George's Caye with the children intergenerationally of Belize. It continues from an original committee of 40 of 1898, the centenary committee, if you will.
1898.
And as well, you had the Black Man Simon Lamb. So the elders would have said centenary. Then you had later on, you had national committees, you had committee of 40. Again, in the 70s, up to the 70s, and the society thought that to be very clear that it's above and beyond politics, adopt the name St. George's Caye Day Society, which speaks for itself.
Is this perhaps one of the oldest societies of its kind in the country?
Well, if it traces, when tracing its roots, I would say so, yes, in that it has revived and continuing, so you know, it reaches back and pulls forward.
Yeah.
So it has that honor.
That's quite impressive. It's the first time learning about the society, and so I appreciate that insight.
I would like to go a little bit further and to talk. You said that you hold some of the traditions and like the parade and so forth for the tent. When it comes to the educational aspect of the Battle of St. George's Caye, how does the society move forward to discuss the event itself and to have conversations like these around the tent?
Well, particularly around this time, the society responds and called upon. And I was delegated and ordered to come here today, short notice. I was to be out district and was ill yesterday, but tent gives us that vitality. So what we usually point to, the Belize history is, and the historians might correct me, Belize history is so large and awesome and immense that we can point to books and sources. So to put it in a short way, we will say it's so well documented. Take it from the imperial forces, the invaders who were defeated. So the Spanish archives, American archives, English archives, Belize history, Jamaica history, it's well documented. And then we will point to books like Shoulder to Shoulder, published in British Honduras in 1928, which has a wealth of information. I think if you look at 1945, St. John's College Journal, you will see a writing about the Grand Victory. I will point to my grandfather who wrote, and I like to use it as a metaphor, an epic poem of 34 stanzas, The Battle and the Flag, and in the bicentenary, the poet laureate of London dramatized it. But it speaks to the battle. Now when you look at the American independence, Wendell Holmes, the former Chief Justice, as he then was, departed now, he wrote a 4-stanza poem to All Ironsides, right? Here we have that. When you look at our history again, and I'll just quickly say this, Belizeans have got to wake up. The very church in Boston has a pew reserved for gentlemen, and I would say, no, I can sit there as a lady of the bay. Because in 1723, our people voted to sell logwood and mahogany to support that effort. And the steeple, depending on how you see it, where Paul Revere rang to say, or his black freeman or slave that the British are coming, that very church. We've had so many amazing things happening to our history that this is a trusted legacy. And as the society chairperson wrote, and the adopted slogan is, we are here because they are here. 10th day of September 1798 was about the battle and the flag of our country, as it then was. 1981, 21st of September, is and remains about the battle and the flag of Belize, as we still are.
I want to get into, she said, documentation. So yeah, and
you talked about the history.
Yes, but I wanted to highlight one thing that Ms. Pitts said, and it was the documentation of the Battle of St. George's Caye. And I know that yourself, Mr. Gian, who is a history lecturer, and of course Rolando Cocom, who works at the Institute for Social and Cultural Research, can attest to that kind of documentation. I know that there were documentations about the Flower Banks 14 and so forth. So, Mr. Cocom, if you could just briefly discuss what the ISCR has been doing in terms of these documents and how they're able to showcase them for the further education of the Belizean community.
So pleasant good morning, April and Paul, and to the guests on the show as well, Ms. Sharon and Gian. Very much pleased to be sharing this platform with you all.
Thank you.
At the Institute for Social and Cultural Research, we have been doing several works over the past years to increase the documentation around the Battle of St. George's Caye, and also provide avenues whereby different perspectives are able to be shared on the basis of research that can be verified at the Belize Archives and Record Service or at the National Heritage Library, and also perspectives that must be reasonable and justified on the basis of historical evidence. And we have done several forums in that regard and produced several works. As it currently stands, just to kind of give the historical context for our audience and for those who may not be so much familiar with the history of this conflict, right. We must bear in mind that this was part of the two imperial rivalries. We have the Spanish on the one hand and the British on the other. Of course, starting from the when Christopher Columbus shows up in this part of the world, thinking it's India, and then therefore we're now called the West Indies throughout the colonial period. Essentially, Spain claims all of this land, and other European states gradually begin to have interest in also taking and extracting resources from this land. Of course, the indigenous population suffered tremendously and devastatingly because of diseases that came along with that colonial contact, that European contact, and also their vicious attempt to deconstruct existing indigenous political practices and populations. You know, in the case of Belize, there were some early Spanish attempts to regroup Maya communities into specific areas. We're thinking about Lamanai, we're thinking about Tipu, and there were resistance by the indigenous population to this. And so what we're thinking about here is conflict and how do different interests play out. And the Spanish would then also have conflict with the British in terms of exercising their sovereignty over this land, claiming it is theirs. The British should not be extracting logwood in the early 1700s, and we're seeing at least seven attempts by the Spanish to remove them from this area called the Bay of Honduras in the early times. And then by 1796, there's another conflict between Spain and Britain, and this is when, as well, the settlers here in what is now Belize, they get word that the Spaniards are preparing to dislodge them once again, and the settlement goes about in confusion. There's a drought at the time, and they also have to make a decision on defending or evacuating. And I know Ms. Sharon is a well-known promoter of this narrative, and so I'll leave that to her. But essentially, there's an ongoing, almost a year and a half of preparations, because the settlers are aware that there's an incoming attempt to dislodge them, and that is what we call the Battle of St. George's Caye. By September 2nd, the Spaniards are already making their way to St. George's Caye. I want to say by September 5th, they are by Caye Chapel, and they have several difficulties to maneuver themselves into these shallow waters and to come and attack at St. George's Caye. Their intention was to attack St. George's Caye and then proceed to what we would call Belize Town or the Halova Creek. But because there a series of reasons, they did not do so, primarily due to a disorganization on the Spaniards' part. There were different leaders had different opinions on what should be done, and some disobeyed the orders. They were also exhausted. They were also not prepared in terms of having the proper knowledge on how to navigate the area. And meanwhile, the British side, although their fleet was smaller, and they were able to navigate the waters better, and they showed their presence in a series of what some historians call skirmishes, exchange of fire essentially, between September 2nd to September 10th, and then I think by September 16th, the Spaniards and the Spanish vessels decide to move away, and they're no longer seen in sight. So what we call and what we celebrate as September 10th is sort of like the last day that the Spaniards begin to retreat.
So I want to cut in here for a moment and
sure.
and
I'm sorry I gave you such a mouthful, but I really wanted to give the audience a larger perspective of what we're discussing.
Right, and this is all according to how we are seeing it in the documentations and so forth. Yes.
Right. So we have in our Belize Archives and Records Service, we have the reports from Captain Moss. We have the reports as well now from the Spanish side, and so we are able to compare the two. And some viewers will remember that we recently did a presentation about this a few years ago, and so the records are pretty much consistent about the conflict itself. But as you know too, there's also a difference between what has been termed these days academic history, which deals a lot with the archival analysis, and what is now called public history, which deals a lot with how communities interpret the past. And that's really a relevant, especially to this case, whereby especially I'm thinking here the 1930s and the 1950s, where there's this different approach by political leaders to say, let's call Battle of St. George's Caye Nationalist Day, and let's use it as a day to fight for greater self-representation, self-determination. And so there's sort of like two angles to this, what I would say academic archival history and public history, which deals a lot with how the past is interpreted by communities.
Right, so I want to then get get the conversation to Gian, because Gian is a history lecturer at SJCJC. So tell us, Mr. Vasquez, how you then take all of this information and explain it to a bunch of students that probably this is the basic foundation of their Belizean history.
Well, then, I don't think I ever explained it in that fashion. Because primarily, as Rolando just mentioned, there is public history, and I am one of those who don't believe that the Battle of St. George's Caye is of any significance to the history of us. Right?
There you go.
And as Ms. Pitts mentioned, it was celebrated 100 years after its original occurrence, 1898.
Clarify that.
Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
It was in 1898 it was first celebrated. Even the motto used, shoulder to shoulder, all of that is colonial vestiges. It is a colonial past. Ms. Pitts even mentioned that in Boston there is a pew that the people here from Belize, the Baymen, are allowed to sit. The people who were here, for the majority of the people who were here, they were enslaved Africans.
Of course, of course.
And so these enslaved Africans would probably never have had the opportunity to be there. And so it's glorifying the history of the person who was writing, who were the Europeans. It is a European history that is being glorified. Because, like, for example, for myself, I am Maya Mestizo. I'm definitely not a Bayman. I will never be a Bayman, right? And that is not a part of what Belize is today.
So then that goes back to my original question before we came on air. What is the definition of a Bayman? Who classifies themselves as such, and what does that mean for us as
So
a
what do
For
you
me-
define?
society?
For me, I don't use the term Bayman because I use the term Belizean. We are Belizeans.
Right.
And there, from 1981, there should have been a revamping of our history, of our identity. We should be moving towards something I would term as Belizean centricity. We are all Belizeans because in today's day, you have children who don't know what ethnicity or what they should call themselves because they come from varying cultures. What do they celebrate? And then, like, when we talk about the 10th, what are we really celebrating? Because if you're saying that Belize became a country as a result of that, then you are doing a disservice, especially to history. Why? Because in 1802, whether that battle got Belize or the British right of conquest of this territory in 1802 in the Treaty of Amiens in Articles 3 and 4, it clearly states that the British gave back all rights to Belize to the Spaniards.
I don't agree with that.
And the only territory they stayed with, specified in the Treaty of Amiens of 1802, is Trinidad. And then you have warfare occurring again. And the only reason Belize was not subsequently attacked was because Europeans were, as Rolando was mentioning, at war. There was war up until the Napoleonic Wars, 1808. And in 1808, Mexico underwent its War of Independence with Hidalgo. And so all of that caused there to be no interest in coming to Belize. And even more so, I would venture to say, my ancestors stood up there in the Yucatan Peninsula. The Maya of the Yucatan Peninsula have been written out of Belizean history because had they not created a barrier up there in the north, the Mexicans would have probably come, even the Spaniards would have walked and marched into Belize and made it Spanish.
Now,
Why is there no mention of that?
Well,
let me ask.
I would
Ms.
say,
Pitts,
no, firstly,
clearly there's some difference of
Difference of
views
opinions,
here
yeah.
and opinions. Would you care to
my
like-
view, and I will speak as a Belizean, because when you asked the question, Baymen, I said before we came on here, Baymen, Keymen, people of the Bay, Pork and Door Boys, the people who were here. And I like to go back. If you take it historically, scientifically, you will see that the very pyramids have effigies to blacks. So Olmec, if you look at the jade head, it looks more like my grandfather's face and the friezes on Lamanai. So we have a mixture of people. And respectfully, in Belize, you have to be very careful because quite a number of us, we can self-declare and self-identify. But we have a lot of things mixed up in us that you can't exclude. But get into the history. Belize's history is well documented, and that is why I said look to the Spaniards. Now with respect to black history, the important thing, I hear the words conflict. The only conflict and victory I see is the decisive defeat of the Spanish invading Armada, which never came back, and that is why we are here. I see unity, and if Belizeans unite around the history of Belize and the common identity as Belizeans, we are good. With respect to the blacks, black people were here who were free people, and black people also came as slaves. We are all black, whether you like it or not, and it's a proud history. The original or earlier coat of arms show two obviously Negro men. That cannot be denied. The importance of the history of the Battle of St. George's Caye, which will not be denied if you want to talk about blacks in this country, is that you had the Flowers Bank, 14 of which only 2 were white. Belize had property qualification so that the parliament held, the public meeting was a parliament at the courthouse where it still is. 1st June 1797, there was a deadlock in the vote, and the blacks came and they voted. They were promised payment as king's troop. That was not fulfilled. There were certain things, but what is undeniable, the very shoulder-to-shoulder coat of arms, is that uniquely in our history, whereas the invading enemy thought they could get the blacks to separate from the white settlers, the lesson from St. George's Caye is that when we come together in common love of the country of Belize against indomitable odds, we prevail. With respect to the Battle of St. George's Caye, and the history for our children is, when I talk about the Battle of St. George's Caye, I will get on to say, well, you know, Samuel Haynes wrote Haven of Democracy. So by the time you look at 1802, 1804, our Garifuna ancestors came here for sanctuary. 1867, War of the Caste, they came again for sanctuary. We had people coming from different times for sanctuary, right up to what we have. And the common Belizean identity, but the common respect for our history. History cannot be denied. You can have perspective, but the thing is, we have, and that is why I said, look at what Spain contributed back to the country of Belize. The history cannot be denied and will not be whitewashed. It's not because we had a negative colonial past that we will throw. Thomas Paslow, who was the leader of the debate and Dr. Patriot, said a man who is not prepared to defend the country should not reap the benefits. And I'm paraphrasing. He disciplined his slave girl over handkerchief, and we know that. But he led that debate, and because of that, when the people who are divided voted, after the Flowers Bank 14, all were united in a common defense of this country of Belize.
All right, so thank you, Miss Fitz. So
I really need
we don't have a lot of time, so I'll have you briefly just chime in, and then I'll ask Mr. Cocom briefly to just kind of give a final wrap-up.
I agree,
and I appreciate the conversation.
Yes, 100%.
Flowers Bank people and men and women came, voted, no doubt about that. The narrative 100 years later fought shoulder to shoulder. That is a farce. There was no fight. There was no physical fight.
When it was celebrated a certain way, it was naturally celebrated at the victory. And we have the details of the munitions, all the war efforts, the sloops. Take it from the Spanish history, take it from the British history.
I just would like to give
all the details of the battle are here, and I can go into some of them.
I gave you the chance to speak, Ms.
Yes,
so
let's have Mr. Vasquez, please.
It was a naval engagement. There was no physical fighting. There was no one who died as a result of it. As Ms. Pitts mentioned, and I was a part of the History Association when the commission was made to retrieve the documents from Captain O'Neill, from the documents in Merida, from the archives, right? So the facts are the facts. But 100 years later, when it was first celebrated, the backdrop to it was that the West Indian soldiers who were, officers who were here, started to make noise, started to revolt against the colonial system because of Crown Colony government. Crown Colony government stripped all blacks of power, all political power. The blacks lost.
Well, I want to
as a result of colonial government,
we can get
of Crown Colony government. When Crown Colony government took over, what did they do? Opposition started, and because opposition started, they tried to create a narrative where the black person and the white person are best friends. And that is why they created that slogan, shoulder to shoulder, to convince the black man that he and the white person had fought 100 years later. And that narrative continues to be told, to be told to our children that we are one and one together with the whites, which was not true.
Clearly, this conversation could continue,
Yes,
and it leaves room to have the discussion in a longer setting.
Yes.
And I have settled, if nothing else, that there is varying views when it comes to the Battle of St. George's Caye, and as respected, educated individuals sitting on the panel, I appreciate the fact that you both come to me with documentation and proof. So what we want to do now in wrapping up the conversation this morning, we want to briefly hear from Mr. Cocom in terms of what has been your experience based on the documentations with these varying views, and how would you seek to reconcile this argument based on documentation?
Thank you, Paul. Really, it's good that there's healthy debate.
There has to be.
I think the only problem is there's the limited time.
Yes, indeed.
Yes.
But thank you as a team for valuing the opinions of us, I think collectively, of Gian and Ms. Sharon. I value their opinions as well. And I think what we are saying is currently playing out is that we need to do more research. We need to do more education. We need to allow people to look at the evidence about each perspective and the multiple perspectives that can also come out of others looking at the archival material, and also not just the archival material, but some of the oral histories that I think Ms. Sharon is pointing to as to why different parts of the community or segments of the community choose to celebrate the Battle of St. George's Caye with a higher level of respect than others. So let me just touch on that just very quickly to say that in the case of the celebrations, whereas Gian is absolutely right that it is until 1898 that there's the first sort of like official and public holiday of the Battle of St. George's Caye. Just a few years before too, there was the celebration of Emancipation Day, 10 years before, 1888, and this was led by Simon Lamb, who was championing for a learning institute to be created. Unfortunately, a storm would come a few years after and destroy what they had started. And what we see in his case is that by the early 1905, I would say a few years after, the Battle of St. George's Caye celebration also became less celebrated, and he took up a key position in mobilizing the community and to do that parade. So I think that is the type of history that we are part of, whereby we can see somebody who was celebrating Emancipation Day and using that as a way to empower African descendants in Belize. But because of the power structure and the resources that are available, and perhaps other factors that we are yet to uncover, he also participated in the celebration of the Battle of St. George's Caye. And I think that is where the community is coming from, whereby we're seeing the Battle of St. George's Caye being celebrated and being valued for multiple reasons. One as a day of claiming the territorial integrity of what is now Belize, but also as a day where they can celebrate the presence of Africans in Belize and their participation in the society. And then there are other conflicts and there are different narratives that emerge later on, as I pointed to. I mean, by the time the nationalist movement is formed, there's this idea that we shouldn't celebrate the Battle of St. George's Caye because that reinforced a colonial society, which it did. They also then wanted to call it Nationalist Day as opposed to the Battle of St. George's Caye Day. And so that's another phase of the history that we regrettably can't get into much at this time. But just to say that there are different perspectives and there's reasons, there's justification as to why our history has unfolded in this way. There's a reason why there's confusion about what space this narrative and this historical event should occupy in the nation. Nonetheless, it is part of the September celebrations, and there is a ceremony that will take place, I believe, in all municipalities and across Belize, and that's an opportunity whereby we can learn from others about their perspectives and learn about the historical event and see how this history and its celebration has unfolded since more than 200 years ago.
Yeah, thank you, Rolando, Cocom, for that. Wrapping up and tying it neatly in a bow when it comes to the varying perspectives of this history. And I will go on to say, thank you both so much for coming in and giving us your insights. And we have to continue the conversation, because the reality is that we don't know our history like that. Yes, there is documentation. Yes, there's archaeology. Yes, there's all of these disparted parts of who we are as a society, but it's not collective, and we have to be able to properly engage and educate.
I agree, and the good thing is that we can read. A lot of the history did not depend on lecturers and even up to university level, but I read about the archaeologists, the scientific evidence, the listening to the oral history and retrieving
Absolutely.
it, listening to the written recorded history, and especially from the very invader. And I like to say that certain things on the surface in 1946, and it coincided with an unfounded claim against this country. Belizeans, beware, you are warned. The beautiful thing is, I think it was commented before we came in, if I may say, and it was like, wow, you want Belizeans not to know something, put it in a book. But if you read the documentation from before and throughout, you don't leave a part of your history. We Belizeans like conflict to deny our history, but when we come together in our history and our people with one solid common identity, you will see how Belize always prevail. And by the grace of God, because while we sleep with one eye open, because the enemy is always nigh. When I celebrate the 10th, my first parade, I was 3 months old in my mother's arm. Nobody messed with my tent. Who can dance Jankuno, and that is Creole too, by the way, because it means to make a mockery of things.
Well, Ms. Smith,
but our history will not be denied. Belize's very future and presence as a country. And I'm ringing a clarion call. Prescription, treaty, legislation. The Battle of St. George's Caye. Watch people where they are going. Watch who try to take that out, and watch where it will have us as a country. You will see in certain things up to the ICJ about the Battle of St. George's Caye. Watch it.
All right.
Don't say you weren't forewarned, people.
Thank you, Ms. Fitz. We are completely, I wish we had more time. I wish I could have given you an hour, but we're completely.
I was thought if you have 60 seconds, make sure you defend and present your position. 60-second version. Remember the 60-second sermon?